I love React Query. I love UI.dev. There are some really fun things going on with both React Query and UI.dev, but we have to start first with the story of React Query. I am very hyped for this video. UI.dev's legitimately probably my favorite dev channel on YouTube. It's hard for me to think what I like more. I've watched every single video on the channel. Even this one, it was just so long ago, it doesn't show anymore. All these videos are awesome. They're so well researched. You might notice that I've never done videos like this. It's because I can't do them better than UI.dev. It's the gold standard for like storytelling in dev videos around specific technologies. It has been very hard for me to not watch this one because I love UI.dev, React Query in the format of these videos. But now we get to watch it together. I can give you guys my thoughts, and we'll see the true reason why React Query won in the end. Let's take a watch.
Have you ever thought about why a specific piece of technology gets popular? Usually there's never a single reason, but I do have a theory that I think is one of the primary drivers. I call it the 5 o'clock rule. With the 5 o'clock rule, the level of abstraction for solving a problem will bubble up until it allows the average developer to stop thinking about the problem, and therefore
I love this. We're 20 seconds in, and I already have a new phrasing to steal. Like, are you kidding? That's so good. The level of abstraction for solving a problem will bubble up until it allows the average dev to stop thinking about the problem. This perfectly encapsulates so many of the things I love and why I love them, and so many of the reasons why people call those things I love skill issues. Like, the magic of Go is that it allowed people to stop thinking about memory management and still have performant applications. The magic of JavaScript is you have code that will run everywhere, and you can stop thinking about runtimes and the places that it might run. The magic of React is you can stop thinking about how your things update. You just update them. You just put new values and the update just happens. The technologies that win are the ones that do the best job of letting the average dev stop worrying about the problem. And I have a good feeling about where this is going in terms of React Query, because React Query has allowed for a lot of problems to go away for most people.
go home at 5 o'clock. This is the story of one such example, a story of how a single developer in a small town in Utah, in his spare time, created a library that is used in 1 out of every 6 React applications.
That number is low, and we need to push it. It should be like 1 in 2 minimum. Like, you know, Tanner's a legend. React Query changed how I think of React and software dev as a whole. It seems so simple, but the value it brings is surreal. So let's see where we go with this.
For context, that means it gets downloaded 3.3 million times a week and has been downloaded 323 times since you started watching this.
Probably way more than that because I've paused so many times throughout. But yeah, 3.3 million a week is kind of nuts for a JavaScript package. Oof.
That library is React Query. And in order to better answer how it allows developers to go home at 5 o'clock, we need to take a closer look at what problems it helps developers to stop thinking about. Believe it or not, that problem is React. And to see why, we need to go back to the basics.
Hot take, don't necessarily disagree. To say that React Query solves a React problem, we'll see. I'm sure he's going to show React Query in a second so that we can understand how it works. If he doesn't, I'll make it a point to explain because I'm sure a lot of you guys don't even know what React Query is or what it does, especially those of y'all who don't use React, but we'll get there as we go. Don't worry.
In its most fundamental form, React is a library for building user interfaces. It's so simple that, historically, the entire mental model has often been represented as a formula where your view is simply a function of your application state. All you have to do is worry about how the state in your application changes, and React will handle the rest. The primary mode of encapsulation for this concept is the component, which encapsulates both the visual representation of a particular piece of UI, as well as the state and logic that goes along with it.
Such a good visualization. Love it. He actually codes all of his visualizations and then screen records them for his videos, fun fact, which I think is so cool that all of these are actual like mini apps he built just to do these animations.
By doing so, the same intuition you have about creating and composing together functions can directly apply to creating and composing components. However, instead of composing functions together to get some value, you can compose components together to get some UI. In fact, when you think about composition in React, odds are you think in terms of this UI composition, since it's what React is so good at. The problem is in the real world, there's more to building an app than just the UI layer. It's not uncommon to need to compose and reuse non-visual logic as well. This
is why hooks are so magical, because components let you compose UI, hooks let you compose logic. I'm not going to spoil the React Query reveal because he's building up to it, so I won't show how it works just yet. I am sorry to anybody hanging on that doesn't know what it is yet. We'll get there, I promise.
This is the fundamental problem that React hooks were created to solve. Just like a component enabled the composition and reusability of UI, hooks enabled the composition and reusability of non-visual logic. The release of hooks ushered in a new era of React, the one that I like to call the how the f do we fetch data era.
yeah, we just didn't fetch the data before, or we did it in even worse, crazier ways. But with hooks, we got too many ways to fetch data, and most of them were bad by default. But yes, I like that he pointed out the hooks are for composition. I think that's an important piece. Love that he brought that in. And yeah, fully aligned so far. Just think it's important to note that we didn't have any good way to fetch data before all this.
What's interesting about all of the built-in hooks that React comes with, as you've probably experienced firsthand, is that none of them are dedicated to arguably the most common use case for building a web app, data fetching. The closest we can get out of the box with React is fetching data inside of useEffect and then preserving the response with useState. You've undoubtedly seen something like this before. We're fetching.
I see basically this exact code far too often, and not even just in like tutorials or examples people are posting, but like actual code bases I'm helping clean up.
Fetching some data from the Pokey API and showing it to the view. Simple. But unfortunately, this is tutorial code, and you can't write tutorial code at work. The most glaring issue is we're not handling the loading or error states. This leads our app.
That's not the most glaring issue. The most glaring issue is that if the ID was to change here and the response for this ID 2 was to come in before the response for ID 1, we're going to set whatever comes back last. If set Pokemon sets to the most recent response, your state, which is the ID here, can be out of sync from the fetch call, because if fetch for 1 comes in second and fetch for 2 comes in first, just by happenstance, the fetch for 1 is going to be what gets set here, even though ID is 2. It's very easy for this to cause desynchronization where you're not canceling the original promise. You can do checks in here to do this. There's an example in the React docs, actually. You can use an effect to fetch data in your component. Note that if you use a framework, your framework's data fetching mechanism will be a lot more efficient than writing effects manually. Yeah. So here's the key here. Let ignore equal false. And then in fetch bio, we do the fetch dot then. If not ignore, we set. And then we have this return. If you return a function in a use effect, this gets called as a cleanup. So if the input change, if person changes to a different string from Alice to Bob or something, the old fetch is still going to be running, but the instance of this hook that existed when the state was Alice has now had this fire, which sets ignore to true. So now when Alice's fetch comes through, this value in that thread, in that instance, has ignore set to true, not the default of false. So it skips this because ignore is true. In the new closure, the new instance of this hook that effectively exists when you change person to something else, ignore gets redefined as false again. And as long as this cleanup doesn't fire, which fires whenever anything here changes. So the order of events is we have Alice, we go through this code. This changes to Bob. This runs with Alice in the old instance. Then the rest here reruns with Bob as the new value. This is where hooks start to get a little bit confusing. And if you don't know these behaviors with effects, as well as these behaviors with fetch, and have a plan to handle these either via manual abort signals or using these types of ignore values and variables, your code's going to have a lot of bugs. Whenever I see somebody post an example like this on Twitter, which I just saw recently from somebody, they showed, I don't think this is this hard, and showed a screenshot of a fetch and an effect, and there was like 4 bugs in it. These things are so common.
The most glaring issue is we're not handling the loading or error states. This leads our app to commit 2 of the biggest UX sins, cumulative layout shift and the infinite spinner. The fix for this is pretty simple, more state. Cool. Because we've used useEffect to synchronize our local Pokemon state with the Pokey API according to ID, we've taken what has historically been the most complex part of building a web app, an asynchronous side effect, and made it an implementation detail behind simply updating ID.
Who here has written code that looks disturbingly like this? Have you written cursed effect fetchers like this? Yes, never, or I don't really use React. More times than I would like to admit. Wrote this like 2 days ago for prod. I remember my first startup, I used Redux and Thunk for all my async fetching. Maintaining the large glob was fucking hell. Yep. Redux and Thunk or Redux Saga, all pretty rough. Fixing one right now, so the timing's on point. You're going to like React Query a lot. Never, but only because you were taught React Query as a junior. That's awesome. I actually really like people who are being taught this early and can see the benefits so ahead of time. Surprised how many non-React people are here. Look at that. There's 2 people here who are React devs that haven't written code like this. 50% of the devs here have, and then 40% don't use React. So fine. But how hilarious is it that almost all of the devs here that use React have had to deal with this? Like a 10-to-1 ratio. We've all done and dealt with and seen and fought this at some point in our careers as React devs. It's painfully common. And that, I would argue, is actually a flaw in React. The fact that we all go down this path at some point indicates that this is a thing that we need in React apps. And it's also a thing React fails to hold our hand in the direction of.
Unfortunately, even though this is where everyone usually stops, we're not quite done yet. In fact, as is, our code contains the worst kind of bug, one that is both inconspicuous and deceptively wasteful.
Oh no, I spoiled the bug.
Can you spot it? Whenever we call fetch, because it's an asynchronous request, we have no idea how long that specific request will take to resolve. It's completely possible that, while we're in the process of waiting for a response, the user clicks one of our buttons, which causes a re-render, which causes our effect to run again with a different ID. In this scenario, we now have 2 requests in flight and no idea which one will resolve first. In other words, we have a race condition. To make it worse, you'll also get a flash of the Pokemon that resolves first before the second one does. So how do we fix this?
I gotta have more cowbell, baby.
Before we get to that, if you're enjoying this video and now feel obligated, you need to give us money, check out Query.DG. It's our brand new interactive official React Query course that we built in close collaboration with the React Query team.
Good use of .gg. Y'all should know by now, I am generally very skeptical of courses. I find that most of them prey on noobs. I am positive UI.DEV is not that. Some of the best educational materials in the entirety of the developer world. And the fact that they're partnering up with the maintainers of libraries to make the best possible resources about those libraries is awesome. And if you're looking for something to spend your company's education budget on, this seems like a really good option. If you see what we talk about going forward and see the benefits of React Query, and you want to see all of the ways to use it, not just quickly in a project, because honestly, React Query, you can spin up and use very trivially and get most of the benefits. The value here is going really deep. It's not just using React Query to avoid using Redux or those other solutions. It could very well let you delete a lot of the existing code and solve much more complex stuff. A lot of this was written by TK Dodo, who is one of my favorite people in the dev space. I use his blog far, far too often. Not just, did he do a Zust in React context? Oh, I abuse this pattern. I remember him doing this. I abuse this pattern all the time. I'm so happy somebody made an actual blog post about it. I've made a bunch of videos that are just me reading his stuff because it's so good. He gets it more than most could ever imagine. It's nuts. So him finally sitting down and doing a course and getting paid for this work, not just doing it for free, very exciting. I might even go buy this course myself just to give it a shot and see what it's like. Highly recommend taking a look at this if it's something that you're interested in. Build your company if you can. And if you're not working at a company that is interested in doing things like this, or you're not making a tech salary, don't pay for courses just yet. But if you have the money, you want to pay for a course, can't imagine money better spent than UI.dev. Query.gg.
React Query course that we built in close collaboration with the React Query team. Okay, back to the video. Really what we want to do is tell React to ignore any responses that come from requests that were made in effects that are no longer relevant.
Did I pre-watch that hard? Did this motherfucker really just open the exact same page I opened in the React docs to discuss the exact same point? I have to rethink a lot of things. Anyways.
In order to do that, we need a way to know if an effect is the latest one. If not, then we should ignore the response and not set Pokemon inside of it. To do that, we can leverage closures along with useEffect's cleanup function. Whenever the effect runs, let's make a variable called ignore and set it to false. Then whenever the effect's cleanup function runs, which will only happen when another request has been made, we'll set ignore to true. Now all we have to do before we call set Pokemon or set error is to check if ignore is true. If it is, we'll just do nothing. Now, regardless of how many times ID changes, we'll ignore every response that isn't in the most recent effect.
How many lines of code is this? Okay, it's almost exactly 40 lines of code for everything associated with the state and data and such about this fetch call. Holy shit.
Yes, welcome to useEffect hell. So at this point, we're finished, right? Well, not quite. If you were to make a PR with this code at work, more than likely someone would ask you to abstract all the logic for handling the fetch request into a custom hook. In doing so, you'd probably end up with something like this.
Let's do another poll. We see here a use query custom hook where you pass it a URL and then it does all of these things there. Who has written this hook at some point? Have you made a custom hook for fetching? I'll say generic hook for fetching. Yes, never, not a React dev. Get used to it. This is what async UI code looks like on any platform. Oh boy, things are going to get way more fun. I feel personally attacked at this point, Gabriel. You poor thing. This is why you're on my payroll now, so you can fix all of these things. The ratio is a little better here, but still painful to see how many people have written this exact code before. I have. I've written it far too many times. Like, hilariously far too many times. Happy this is closer to a 50-50 split, but still painful. You should be happy you never did this because hopefully it's because you know better and you're using React Query already. But yeah, you haven't, but one of your first tasks was to undo it all. That's awesome. You're getting really good experience, John. Like if those are the things that you're doing for your job, like gutting the old code and making things more maintainable, it sucks. You're going to do some really hard and painful work, but goddamn, you're going to learn so much and be super hireable. Yeah. Y'all get the point. Yes, never, not. Yeah. It's still very common. It's not the default anymore, which is nice, but like I've written almost this exact code in multiple code bases and been paid for it far too many times.
I still remember how proud I was when I first made this abstraction. That is, until I started using it. As is, this hook doesn't address another fundamental problem of using state and effects for data fetching, data duplication. By default, the fetched data is only ever local to the component that fetched it. That's how React works. Every component will have its own instance of the state, and every component has to show a loading indicator to the user while it gets it. Even worse, it's possible that while fetching to the same endpoint, one request could fail while the other succeeds. Or one fetch could lead to data that is different than a subsequent request. All the predictability that React offers just went out the window. Now, if you're an experienced React dev, you might be thinking that if the problem is that we're fetching the same data multiple times, can't we just move that state up to the nearest parent component and pass it down via props?
Or even better, throw all of it in a context and just hope that works, right?
Or better, put the fetch data on context so that it's available to any component that needs it. Sure, and if we did that, we'd probably end up with something like this.
More code I have shamefully written.
Well, it works, but this is the exact type of code that future you will hate current you for. Besides all of the context mess,
not just code that future you will hate current you for, the next person stuck maintaining the code base is going to have to refigure out your way of doing it.
And if we did that, we'd probably end up with something like this. Well, it works, but this is the exact type of code that future you will hate current you for. Besides all of the context mess, the biggest change that we've made is to the shape of our state. Because our state now needs to be able to store the data loading and error states for multiple URLs, we've had to make it an object where the URL itself is the key. Now, every time we call useQuery with the URL, it'll read from the existing state if it exists or fetch if it doesn't. With that, we've now just introduced a small in-memory cache and predictability has been restored. Unfortunately, we've traded our predictability problem for an optimization problem. As you might know, React Context isn't a tool that's particularly good at distributing dynamic data throughout an application since it lacks a fundamental trait of state managers, being able to subscribe to pieces of your state. As is, any component that calls useQuery will be subscribed to the whole query context, and therefore will re-render whenever anything changes, even if the change isn't related to the URL it cares about.
Well, with React Compiler, this goes away now, right? Okay, it does actually kind of go away, but not enough so to be the right choice. But memoization at the context level is going to make a lot of these problems less bad, but having all of your data stuffed in a context will always be painful and cause things to update when they shouldn't and not update when they should, and a lot of fun to debug. Still better than Redux, but not enough better. Yeah, this graph doesn't show all of the children of those things re-rendering too, which is another fun problem.
Also, if two components call useQuery with the same URL at the same time, unless we can figure out how to dedupe those requests, our app will still make two requests since useEffect is still called once per component. And since we've introduced a cache, we also need to introduce a way to invalidate it. And as you may know, cache invalidation is hard. What started out as a simple, innocent pattern for fetching data in a React application has become a coffin of complexity. And unfortunately, there's not just one thing to blame. At this point, 1, 2, and 3 should be obvious. So let's dive into number 4. Synchronous state is the state that we're typically used to when working in the browser. It's our state, which is why it's often called client state. We can rely on it to be instantly available when we need it, and no one else can manipulate it, so it's always up to date. All these traits make client state easy to work with since it's predictable. There isn't much that can go wrong if we're the only ones who can update it. Asynchronous state, on the other hand, is state that is not ours. We have to get it from somewhere else, usually.
There's one other place that's important that you can get this state from. Your device. Not as in like in your current running instance of React, but something like your AV devices. So I built the app Ping for video calls. And with Ping, we need to know which video cameras are available, which mics are available, all those types of things. We need to make connections for WebRTC stuff that is being processed with browser APIs. A lot of those browser APIs are async. How do you get those into your React code reasonably? I use React Query, and I'll show you how cool that is in a bit.
A server, which is why it's often called server state. Server state persists, usually in a database, which means it's not instantly available. This makes managing it, particularly over time, tricky. Though it's far too common, it's problematic to treat these two kinds of state as equal. To manage client state in a React app, we have lots of options. But what are our options for managing server state in a React app?
Server components, they don't help here.
Historically, there weren't many. That is, until React Query came along. Ironically, you may have heard that React Query is the missing piece for data fetching in React. That couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, React Query is not a data fetching library.
Woo, thanks for saying it so I don't have to. Oh, yeah, React Query is the missing async primitive for React.
And that's a good thing, because it should be clear by now that data fetching itself is not the hard part. It's managing that data over time that is. And while React Query works with data fetching, a better way to describe it is as an async state manager that is also acutely aware of the needs of server state. In fact, React Query doesn't even fetch any data for you. You provided a promise, and React Query will then take the data that that promise resolves with and make it available wherever you need it throughout your entire application. From there, it can handle all of the dirty work that you're either unaware of or you shouldn't be thinking about in the first place. And the best part about it?
I did not think I was going to be in this. Oh, that was a banger tweet too. I actually did not think I would. It's so silly. I'm going to geek out for a second because I hope I emphasized this point properly before. The amount I look up to Tyler in UI.DEV in this channel is insane. The fact that I'm in a UI.DEV video is surreal. Even if it's a dumb meme tweet, this is within one of my highest honors. Yeah, thank you, Tyler. Like, sincerely. Yeah, that's really cool. I'm just going to sit here and smile and be pumped about this.
You can stop trying to figure out how useEffect works, which is why it solves the 5 o'clock rule. If you enjoyed this video, check out Query GG. It's our brand new interactive official React Query course that we built in close collaboration with the React Query team.
Check out his course. I want to dig in a bit more on using React Query correctly quick because it's really cool and pretty easy to work with. Let's quickly spin up just a Vite React app. It's probably the easiest thing. Sandbox. I'll put it in content. Bunx, create Vite, RQ, demo. React. Apparently SWC is now the blessed way to do things with Vite. They're trying to go deeper on the SWC direction. Happy to comply. Let's hop into main TSX. Let's quickly go to the React query setup. Installation. Oh yeah, it's rebranded as TanStack query now. I probably should have mentioned that earlier. Bun add TanStack React query. Quick start. We got to add the query client. Important detail. Technically speaking, React query still uses context. It's an implementation detail, and they abuse it to make things significantly better than you ever could if you did it yourself. I know that because I've tried to do it myself, and I sucked at it, and I'm pretty good at this stuff. So now we have this in. We have our query client. This is an object that we can abuse and use for other things. You almost never should, but if you do need to, very, very powerful. Let's actually use this now. We could do a traditional fetch like they had in all the examples. I'm sure they even have one here. Do they have where do the to-dos come from? Oh, that's my API. Cool. We're not going to do that. We're going to use some weird browser stuff instead. So I'm going to kill all of this code because I don't want any of it. I'm just going to kill the whole body here. Return div hi. Just make sure it works. Bun run dev local 5173. Cool. Hi. A nice basic React app. I want more though. I want to list all of my AV devices. So let's make a function for it. Async function get AV devices. Const available devices equals, there we go. Navigator.mediadevices.enumerate devices. Believe it or not, TypeScript is smart enough to actually have types that it generates from this. We need to do something with this. I'm just going to be lazy and return it directly. So now we have this get AV devices function. It's never used for anything. Let's fix that. Const data equals, this is going to be the old use query syntax. So we will fix that by putting this in an object where we now need to have a query key, which we'll just make, look at that autocomplete. Devices, query function, get AV devices. And now I have this data, which should have all my devices. I could even do is loading or is error and have separate if is error, return error, if is loading, return loading. I'll do below if is error or no data, because that would be an error case in my opinion. But now we know we have the data. So we can do data.map. And now we have here all of these devices. So if I mark this as device, I can do div, device.label, div. This needs to be keyed or it'll be mad. This should really be included in the template, but that's fine. Device ID, nice. And now when I go to this page, we'll probably have to give it device permissions because it doesn't have permission to access my camera and such. So I was right. I didn't have device permissions, which is why none of that made any sense. I changed this back to label. Here, are all of my devices that my Chrome instance has access to. We have the MacBook Pro mic, which is default, which is separate from MacBook Pro mic because of the way Apple does things. We have the default output, which is the HDMI output, as well as that separated, as well as the MacBook Pro speakers. I'm getting all of this with hilariously little code. I'm literally just calling navigator.mediadevices.enumerate devices and just dropping that as the query function. And now I have this data. Where things get really fun is if I console log in here, log getting AV devices. We go back here, I refresh, we look at console, it gets called once. Cool. What if I take this component, I make function device list, and I just yoink all of the content here, paste that in there, and I return here, return div device list. But let's say I put 3 of them. Let's check that console. Still only calling once, even though we're logging a whole bunch. How are we only calling once despite all of that? Oh, because React queries also debouncing. Now, this is just handled. We can call this hook anywhere, and we're good. If I wanted to call it in different components, that's fine too. Export, const, look at that. So autocomplete friendly too. And I can just return the use query results here and call this hook instead. Const, data is loading as error, use AV devices. And now this can be reused across my entire code base, and it's handled. Is it memoized was a question in chat? Yes, it's memoized, it's debounced, it's all the things you could possibly do correctly, done correctly for you right here. It's great. It's super, super, super convenient. It makes life way better. And we can get even simpler with this code if we really want to. Let's throw this back in here, get rid of this abstraction. Now let's take this navigator media device enumerate thing, paste that there, delete all that. And here we go. Here is all of the code for getting all of your media devices, having data, loading states, error states, all debounced. That's it. You take the promise, you give it a key, and now you have all the data. It's all deduped, it's all memoized. It all just works. If you want to be more controlling of it with like cache times, you can look at all the cool things that exist here, like GC time, max pages if you're using pagination stuff, refetch intervals, just how often should it refetch this data, which can be really, really handy if you want this data to be refetched when, I don't know, things happen. Like if some other device is added or removed, you can auto refetch. Also very useful is refetch on window focus. So if I switch windows and come back, it will rerun the queries by default. There's a really nice page on the TanStack query docs, important defaults. This is an opinionated page because this is an opinionated solution, and they describe a lot of these defaults and why they think they're important. Out of the box, TanStack query is configured with aggressive but sane defaults. Sometimes these defaults can catch new users off guard or make learning and debugging difficult if they're unknown by the user. I will say I had a fun IQ meme here where I started using React Query. Like, these defaults make no sense. They're causing me so many problems. This is so dumb. Turned off all of them. And over time, ended up turning them all back on because they're actually really good. It's really nice. To change this behavior, you can configure your queries both globally and per query using the stale time option. But by default, use query if query, consider cache data as stale. So if the data is cached, it assumes it's stale. So if you call a hook again somewhere else, it's going to refetch. It will give you the stale data, but it will also refetch behind the scenes and update it when the update happens. They'll also refetch when new instances of the query mount, when the window's refocused, when the network's reconnected, or the query is optionally configured with a manual refetch interval. Super, super nice. To change this functionality, you can use options like refetch on mount, refetch on window focus, refetch on reconnect, and refetch interval. You can set them globally to be different, or you can set them on a per hook, per use query level too. Really, really nice. It just handles a lot of these things. What you might be thinking as you see all the stuff that this does is, wait, is that a state machine then? Is this like a Redux alternative? Yes and no. On one hand, if you use stuff like use effect and use state all properly, you don't need Redux until much further along. So if before we had hooks, you needed to use Redux really early because you needed a way to have global state, made a lot of sense. But with hooks and context in these things, the point at which you need a dedicated solution for that global state gets pushed further and further down the experience of building these things over time to the point where you might never end up needing it. The same way that you might not need your Postgres database to scale, or you might not need your service to handle thousands of concurrents, you might not need to introduce something like Redux to your app if the solutions you have already keep the problems it solves further away from you. React Query is so good that the majority of applications introducing things like Redux just for fetching and basic async stuff probably don't need it. On the Ping video call app, we do have both Zustand and Jodi as state managers, but their use is very much boxed into very specific, complex state machine-like problems. And as soon as our needs are just promise-based, like I need to take this async thing and get it into React, have it accessible across my whole app, React Query makes that hilariously simple to the point where most of my apps are totally fine with the only state machines being React Query and just being React's core stuff. It is very rare I find myself reaching for more things because I don't very often need more, because React Query solves so many of your async problems that the need for more focused and state machine-y tools gets punted so far that when you do need them, you know, but until then, you don't even think about them. React Query's made it so I don't need a state machine unless I need a state machine. And most of the time I don't, which means when I do need one, it's more obvious and exciting. And when I don't, it's just not something I think about. A lot of the beginner questions I see and a lot of the experienced questions I see just maintaining React code bases, a lot of those questions just go away if you know the basics of React Query. And I really think every React dev should go build a quick thing using RQ because it will make your life much easier and you'll be able to bring lessons back with you to other things. Even if you don't use React Query at work or you don't use React at all at work, the patterns and the way these things work are so useful that you can take them other places and reuse them there too. And it really is as simple as you pass a promise to the function, you give it a key so it can be deduped across your app, and now you're done. Now you have the best way to use async stuff in your React. Really important that I also call out, because I just saw this in chat, this isn't just for queries. React queries also for mutations. They have a whole section here for mutations where you want loading, error, all those states on something that a user does. So I can just copy paste this. I'll hop in here, const, I'm just gonna make empty object now, use mutation, same deal, pass whatever you want, mutation function. Oh, cool, this is, twice is clear, value never read, cool, we don't actually care about that. So this is getting user media on click. So if we want something to happen here, be you make a post or you change your audio device, you mute something, you update some data, you do something in this function, we now have mutate, we have is pending, which means it's going, is success. If it returns data, we have the data here too. Well, I'm already using the key data, so we have to change it to result. And now I have this mutate function I can call anywhere. So I can just go in here, on click equals mutate. And it is that easy to take a random function, synchronous or asynchronous, and get it hooked in to your React query logic. Let's say when this fires, you want to update the values here. Let's say this somehow changes what this returns because we activate or deactivate a device or something. Cool. So we can invalidate basically wherever. We need the query client though. So const query client, use query client. Cool. Get this imported too. This is the query client that keeps track of all the cache and stuff. And in here, updating the existing stuff is as simple as query client.invalidate queries, whatever you want to pass in here. I thought this would just take that. Oh, sorry. It's query keys object now. But in here, devices. And now any query that has the key devices will get invalidated, which means that whenever we do something with it, whenever we call this mutation, these will all rerun. So if this returns something different now, whenever we call query client.invalidate queries, every single place this hook is called with this key in our code base is now going to be invalidated and updated. Do you know how complex it is to make logic like this without bringing in a core state machine? The ability to just do this without needing that is magic. One more piece, thank you, Gabriel, for reminding me. You might notice me here, docs. It's a silly thing, but if you do invent all of this functionality yourself, which let's be clear, you can do. You can build most of this functionality yourself inside of React using built-in hooks. But if you do that, who's going to document it? Who's going to maintain it? Who's going to fix this or use it in the future? If you use something like React Query, even if you don't agree with every decision it made, now the next person has docs they can go to instead. For this reason alone, it's almost irresponsible to not use React Query instead of building your own solution, which is what so many end up doing. If your choices are between building your own and using React Query, building your own better have a very, very, very good reason. Because if you're throwing away the performance wins, the ecosystem, the documentation, the resources, the materials, all of these things, because you think you can do something better, you better be able to do that thing a lot better. Because otherwise, this is hard to beat. The docs are free. Anyone can go to these. If you want to go deeper, the course is now on sale. I think that's a really cool thing. I'm pumped that that exists. But you shouldn't feel like you have to use that because the docs, as they are phenomenal. The crazy stuff on TK's blog is incredible. He has a whole series, by the way. Go to any of his React Query posts. Practical React Query. This is a free post. This is the starting point. And all of these are a series that are all free for anyone to read. Good luck beating out these resources with a self-rolled thing that nobody wants to touch, much less maintain. Please consider React Query if you haven't already. I have a bunch of videos talking about it already. Personal favorite of mine, React Query is still essential. My favorite React library. Everything I said in here still stands. It was admittedly not that long ago. I want to drive home this point. React Query is not going anywhere as long as we have promises and React code. Like, React needs a way to handle async, and React Query is still by far the best way to handle it. I think that's all I have to say on this one. I enjoyed this a lot. I love UI.DEV, and I love React Query. So huge shout out to everybody who made this possible, both the library, the video, and now also this course. Thank you as always, and until next time, peace nerds.